The small town of Black Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, had always been a place of quiet unease. The kind of town where the shadows seemed to linger a little too long, and the whispers of the wind carried secrets no one dared to speak aloud. It was a town where faith was as much a part of life as breathing, and the old church at the center of town stood as a testament to that faith. But faith, as the townsfolk would soon learn, could be a double-edged sword. Father Michael Donovan had been the town's priest for over a decade. He was a man of unwavering conviction, a shepherd to his flock, and a pillar of the community. But lately, something had changed. The once warm and welcoming church now felt cold and foreboding, and Father Donovan's sermons had taken on a darker tone. He spoke of sin and damnation with a fervor that bordered on obsession, and his eyes, once kind and gentle, now burned with an intensity that made even the most devout parishioners uneasy. It was on a cold, moonless night that the first incident occurred. Sarah Thompson, a young mother of two, had gone to the church to confess her sins. She had always been a faithful woman, but lately she had been plagued by nightmares, visions of fire and brimstone, of a faceless figure whispering unspeakable things in her ear. She hoped that confession would bring her peace, but what she found in the confessional that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she knelt in the darkness, the familiar scent of incense filling her nostrils, she began to speak. But before she could finish her first sentence, the voice that responded was not Father Donovan's. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a malice that made her blood run cold. "You think your sins can be forgiven, Sarah?" the voice hissed. "You think you can escape what you've done?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to stand, but an unseen force held her in place. The air around her grew thick, and the temperature dropped until she could see her breath in the dim light. The voice continued, each word dripping with venom. "You are mine, Sarah. You always have been." She screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the shadow of a figure emerging from the darkness, its eyes glowing like embers. When Sarah woke, she was lying on the cold stone floor of the church, alone. She stumbled out into the night, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare, but the bruises on her arms and the lingering stench of sulfur told her otherwise. Over the next few weeks, more incidents occurred. People who went to the church for solace came back changed, hollow-eyed and trembling, speaking of voices in shadows. The town was on edge, and rumors began to spread. Some said Father Donovan had gone mad. Others whispered of a curse, but no one dared to speak the truth aloud. It was young Tommy Jenkins who finally uncovered the truth. Tommy was a curious boy, always getting into places he shouldn't, and when he heard the rumors about the church, he couldn't resist investigating. He waited until nightfall, then slipped into the church through a side door. The air inside was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. He made his way to the confessional, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, he heard a low, guttural chanting coming from within. He peeked through the curtain and saw Father Donovan kneeling on the floor, his hands clasped in prayer. But it was no prayer Tommy had ever heard before. The words were ancient, filled with a power that made the very air around him vibrate. And then, as if sensing his presence, Father Donovan turned, and Tommy saw his eyes, black as coal, with no trace of the man he once was. Tommy ran, his screams echoing through the empty streets of Black Hollow. He told his parents what he had seen, but they refused to believe him. It wasn't until the next morning, when Father Donovan was found dead in the church, that the truth could no longer be ignored. The townsfolk gathered in the church, their faces pale with fear. The body of Father Donovan lay at the altar, his face frozen in a mask of terror. But it was the words scrawled in blood on the walls that sent a chill through their hearts. The sins of the father shall be visited upon the children. As the townsfolk stood in stunned silence, the ground beneath the church began to tremble. The walls cracked, and the air filled with the sound of laughter, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. The shadows in the corners of the church began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. And then from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, its form shifting and indistinct, but its eyes burned with a malevolent light. The townsfolk screamed and tried to flee, but the doors of the church slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figure raised its hand, and the air was filled with the sound of screams. When the sun rose the next morning, the church was empty. The townsfolk were gone, and the only sign of what had happened was the blood-stained altar and the words scrawled on the walls. Black Hollow was never the same after that. The church was sealed shut, and the town became a ghost of its former self. But sometimes on cold, moonless nights, the sound of chanting can still be heard coming from within the church, and the shadows seem to move with a life of their own. And so the story of Black Hollow serves as a warning, a reminder that faith, when twisted, can become a force of unimaginable evil, and that some sins can never be forgiven.